The summer sun cast a warm, golden glow over the lush vines as Jake rolled down the gravel path, leading into the heart of the vineyard. At 24, freshly graduated, and driven by the ambition to start his career, Jake had never imagined his internship at the vineyard would be more than a brief departure from city life. It was simply a line on his resume, a practical step before the real job he would eventually pursue. But standing there, taking in the scent of ripening grapes and the sight of the rolling fields, he felt something unusual pull, almost as if he were stepping into a place that held secrets, waiting to be uncovered. Caroline appeared at the far end of the vines, her posture both poised and relaxed, her figure framed by the arc of grape-laden branches. She was unlike anyone Jake had ever met. At 51, she carried an elegance that was both graceful and grounded, as though the earth itself had lent her its strength. She approached him with a welcoming smile, her hazel eyes radiating warmth beneath a wide-brimmed hat that shaded her from the late afternoon sun. "Welcome, Jake," she said, extending a hand. Her voice was low and melodic, like the distant murmur of leaves stirred by a breeze. "I'm Caroline." Jake shook her hand, finding her grip surprisingly firm. He quickly noticed the hint of soil beneath her nails and a glint of mischief in her gaze, both of which seemed to contradict her otherwise refined appearance. She was the vineyard's owner and had been since inheriting it from her late husband. But there was a hint of mystery behind her smile that Jake couldn't ignore, something intriguing that hinted at stories left untold. Their first week was filled with typical vineyard tasks, checking the grapevines, assessing the ripening fruit, and preparing for the upcoming harvest. Caroline shared bits of her knowledge, her words weaving through the air with a sense of reverence for the vines that had supported her through years of solitude. Jake was entranced, not only by the knowledge but by the way she spoke, each word layered with experience and a love for her work. One evening, after a long day beneath the sun, Caroline invited Jake to the small cottage nestled at the vineyard's edge. The scent of her homemade meal filled the room, and candlelight flickered softly, casting shadows that seemed to dance on the walls. They sat at her kitchen table, plates filled with fresh ingredients harvested from the garden outside. Conversation flowed easily, and Jake found himself captivated by her insights, her stories of travel, and the sacrifices she had made to maintain the vineyard. There was a depth in her that stirred something within him, an appreciation and a strange yearning he couldn't quite define. As the evening wore on, they moved to the porch, where a soft breeze stirred the vines and the stars began to punctuate the darkening sky. Caroline poured them each a glass of wine, her gaze drifting toward the vineyard stretching out like an ocean beneath the night. "You know," she began, her voice almost a whisper, "sometimes I feel like these vines are all I have. They've been here for me when no one else was." Jake felt a pang of empathy and reached out, covering her hand with his. "You've created something incredible here, Caroline. I'm starting to see why this place means so much to you." They lingered, their hands joined, both silent as the night deepened around them. Something stirred between them, a spark, an unspoken recognition. Caroline's gaze softened, and Jake felt his heart quicken, sensing the boundaries between them begin to blur. Neither of them spoke, letting the silence convey what words could not. As the days melted into weeks, Jake and Caroline's friendship deepened. He looked forward to their quiet talks amid the vines, where the air was sweet with the scent of grapes and sunlight dappled the ground around them. Caroline opened up to him in ways that surprised them both. She shared fragments of her past stories of her marriage, her heartbreak, the loneliness that had settled over her life like a fog after her husband's untimely death. One sultry afternoon, as they worked side by side harvesting the grapes, Jake noticed the lines around her eyes soften as she spoke, her laughter light and free. She was a woman of contradictions, strong yet vulnerable, grounded yet restless. As she wiped the sweat from her brow, she paused, looking at him with a rare vulnerability. "Jake, what brought you here?" she asked. Jake hesitated, caught off guard by the directness of her question. "I suppose I just wanted to experience something different. Life in the city can feel so disconnected. I wanted to be somewhere real, to feel like I was part of something that mattered." Caroline nodded thoughtfully. "Well, you found it here," she said with a smile that warmed him to his core. As they continued to work, Jake realized that his attraction to her was growing, deepening beyond admiration into something he was not entirely prepared to face. Their age difference should have been a deterrent, but instead it only added to the allure, as if the years separating them lent their connection a sense of mystery and rarity. There was an undeniable chemistry between them, a current that hummed beneath every shared glance and touch. They were drawn to each other, bound by an invisible thread that neither could see but both could feel. One evening, as the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon, Caroline invited Jake to stay for dinner again. The cottage was aglow with the same gentle candlelight, and as they shared a bottle of her finest vintage, their conversation took a more personal turn. She spoke of her hopes and regrets, the missed chances and unspoken dreams that haunted her. In return, Jake shared his own uncertainties, his struggles with finding his path and making peace with his own choices. Their closeness culminated in a tender moment, a brush of hands, a gaze held a second too long. Finally, unable to resist, Jake leaned in and kissed her, the taste of wine lingering between them. The kiss was hesitant at first, testing, tasting, as if they were each afraid to fully acknowledge the emotions that had been building for weeks. But when they broke apart, breathing heavily, there was no denying what had passed between them. Caroline's eyes shone with a mix of joy and trepidation. "Jake, this is complicated," she murmured, a slight tremor in her voice. Jake brushed a strand of hair from her face. "I don't care. I just know I feel something here. Something real." They both knew that their connection would come with consequences, that the world beyond the vineyard would judge them harshly. But in that moment, none of it mattered. They were wrapped in a cocoon of their own making, an oasis of warmth and intimacy in a world that often felt cold and indifferent. The days that followed were a whirlwind of secret smiles, stolen glances, and quiet rendezvous amid the vines. Jake and Caroline found solace in each other's arms, a refuge from the world that would not understand their love. Yet, as they grew closer, they could not shake the feeling that their happiness was precarious, as delicate as a vine stretching toward the sun. One afternoon, a stranger arrived at the vineyard, a tall man with a lean frame and a watchful gaze that seemed to miss nothing. He introduced himself as Victor, a wine distributor interested in adding Caroline's vineyard to his portfolio. His visit, though business-oriented, unsettled Jake. There was something about Victor's tone, a possessiveness in the way he spoke to Caroline, that set Jake on edge. Caroline greeted Victor warmly but kept her distance, her usual ease replaced by a guardedness that did not go unnoticed. As they discussed business, Jake could see the tension in her posture, a hint of discomfort she tried to hide. When Victor left, Caroline seemed visibly shaken. "Who was that?" Jake asked, sensing more behind her reaction than she was willing to admit. Caroline hesitated, looking out over the vineyard with an unreadable expression. "Victor is someone I knew a long time ago," she replied carefully. "We were involved once, but that was years before I met my husband." There was a flicker of pain in her eyes, as if the mere mention of Victor had stirred memories she had long tried to bury. Jake reached for her hand, his concern for her overriding his jealousy. "Is he a threat to us?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Caroline turned to him, her eyes softening. "I won't let him come between us, Jake. But there are things about my past that you don't know, things that I hoped would stay buried." Jake's curiosity was piqued, and his concern deepened. Caroline's past seemed to hold more secrets than she'd let on, secrets that now felt like shadows creeping into the vineyard's warm embrace. Over the following days, he sensed her restlessness, her gaze frequently drifting toward the hills, as though haunted by memories she couldn't shake. Their once carefree evenings grew tense, the weight of the unspoken hanging between them. One evening, as they shared a quiet dinner, Jake decided he couldn't hold back his questions any longer. "Caroline," he began gently, "I feel like there's so much about your past that you're hiding from me. If Victor's a threat, if he's here to disrupt what we have, I want to understand." Caroline set her glass down, her fingers tracing its rim thoughtfully. She let out a deep breath, her expression a mixture of vulnerability and resignation. "Jake, there are things I never wanted to revisit. My relationship with Victor was complicated. He was charming, intelligent, and had a magnetic pull I couldn't resist. But he was also possessive, and our relationship grew toxic over time. I ended things, but he never accepted it. When I married my husband, Victor disappeared from my life, or so I thought. Now, it seems he's come back." Jake felt a surge of protectiveness. "Do you think he wants something from you? Does he know about us?" Caroline shook her head. "I don't think so. But Victor is the type to sense weakness, to find the smallest vulnerabilities and exploit them. He knows how to make himself seem indispensable, persuasive. I'm afraid he might try to use the vineyard as leverage, to worm his way back into my life." Her words cast a shadow over their relationship, and Jake felt a pang of anger at Victor's intrusion. But beneath his anger lay a resolve to protect Caroline. He wanted to confront Victor, to make it clear that Caroline was no longer alone and wouldn't be manipulated by anyone, especially not a man from her past. Yet, he knew he had to tread carefully. Victor was unpredictable, and he didn't want to put Caroline at further risk. As the days passed, Victor's visits became more frequent, each one an unwelcome disruption in the vineyard's peaceful rhythm. He claimed to be finalizing business arrangements, but Jake sensed that his intentions went beyond professional interests. He noticed the subtle glances Victor cast Caroline's way, the way his hand would linger on her arm a moment too long. The tension between the three of them mounted, and Jake's patience wore thin. One evening, as Victor prepared to leave after yet another business discussion, Jake found himself unable to hold back any longer. He followed Victor out, catching him just as he reached his car. "Victor," Jake began, his voice steady but laced with warning, "I think you've made your point. You've been here enough times to understand the vineyard's business. I don't know what game you're playing, but whatever it is, it ends now." Victor turned, his expression amused. "Ah, young Jake, you think you're here to protect her, don't you?" He chuckled, a cold, unsettling sound. "Caroline and I go way back. There's a history between us that you wouldn't understand." Jake clenched his fists, his restraint wearing thin. "That may be, but Caroline has made her choices. She doesn't need you around anymore, and she certainly doesn't need your interference." Victor's smile faded, his gaze hardening. "Perhaps she doesn't need me, but people like her, people who've built everything from the ground up, they understand loyalty. Something that takes more than a summer to cultivate." He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a low murmur. "Be careful, Jake. You're young, impressionable. This isn't the life you think it is." With that, Victor got into his car, leaving Jake standing alone under the fading twilight, a sense of unease lingering in the air. Victor's words gnawed at Jake's confidence, filling him with doubt. Was he really prepared for a life entangled with Caroline, a life that held burdens from her past? He felt torn between his love for her and the overwhelming weight of the unknowns that had begun to cloud their once idyllic romance. Caroline sensed his unease, and as much as he tried to reassure her, the cracks in their bond were becoming harder to hide. One evening, as they walked through the vineyard under a pale moon, Caroline finally broke the silence. "Jake, if this is too much, if you need to step back, I would understand." Her words struck him with the force of a blow. "Caroline, I don't want to leave, but there are things I need to know. Things you're holding back. I love you, but I can't keep fighting shadows." Caroline looked away, her shoulders sagging. She knew he was right. With a deep breath, she began to tell him about her late husband and the years of quiet suffering she endured in a marriage that had grown cold long before he passed. Her husband had been a good man, but distant, wrapped up in his own world, leaving her feeling isolated and unfulfilled. Victor had reappeared briefly during that time, reminding her of a different life, one that she had long buried. "When my husband died, I was relieved," she admitted quietly. "It's a horrible thing to feel, but it's the truth. I wanted to start over, to make something of my life that was my own." Jake listened, his heart aching for the loneliness she had endured. It was clear that the vineyard was more than just a business to her, it was her sanctuary, her redemption. And in that moment, he understood just how deeply rooted her fears of losing it to someone like Victor were. Their conversation seemed to lift a weight from her, and as the days passed, their bond grew stronger, more resilient, grounded in a shared understanding. Jake felt his resolve renewed, more certain than ever of his place in her life. But he also knew that Victor was unlikely to disappear quietly. It wasn't long before Victor's intentions became clear. He made a bold offer to Caroline, proposing to buy out a substantial share of the vineyard, using business jargon and lofty promises to mask his true aim. Caroline's refusal was swift and unambiguous, but Victor wasn't deterred. He began visiting more frequently, each time with a new tactic, testing her defenses. One evening, as Jake and Caroline were locking up for the night, they found Victor waiting outside, his expression unreadable. Caroline's patience had reached its limit. "Victor, I don't know what you're trying to accomplish," she said firmly, "but this vineyard is mine. Whatever we had in the past, whatever you think you're owed, it's over." Victor's gaze darkened. "Be careful, Caroline. You may have inherited this place, but it was built on debts. Debts that I helped you navigate when your husband was alive. You don't want to cross me." Jake's temper flared. "You're not welcome here anymore, Victor. If you keep showing up, I'll make sure the authorities know about your harassment." Victor sneered. "You think you can scare me, boy?" He looked at Caroline one last time. "You're making a mistake, Caroline. But maybe that's just something you'll have to learn the hard way." With those ominous words, he left, but the tension lingered long after he was gone. That night, as they sat together in the quiet of Caroline's cottage, they knew they would need to confront Victor once and for all. Desperate to sever Victor's hold on Caroline, Jake decided to do some digging. After days of discreet investigation, he uncovered information that could ruin Victor a series of financial scams, each shadier than the last. Armed with proof, Jake confronted Victor one final time. "You think you can manipulate Caroline?" Jake demanded, his voice steely. "You're nothing but a con, and I have the evidence to prove it." Victor's smug expression faltered. "You're making a mistake, Jake." Jake held his ground. "Leave her alone, or I swear I'll expose every dirty deal you've ever made." Victor glared at Jake, but he knew he was cornered. Without another word, he turned and walked away, his defeat unmistakable. With Victor finally gone, peace returned to the vineyard. Caroline and Jake's love, forged in the fires of struggle and resilience, blossomed in the quiet beauty of the land they now shared. Their future was uncertain, but for the first time they felt truly free, ready to face whatever lay ahead together. So if you love this story, be sure to subscribe, hit the bell, and comment below. Your interaction helps us grow.